Imagine standing inside a great Christian city, its churches alive with song, its markets busy with trade, its people confident that God and their allies will protect them. And now imagine all of that reduced to silence. In the year 540, that's what happened to Milan in northern Italy. Once the second largest city in the region, once famous for its worship and leadership, Milan suddenly found itself trapped. The Ostrogoth army encircled the city, and determined to crush it, they started a siege. Inside the walls, men and women prayed for relief. They convinced themselves that the Byzantine Empire, powerful allies to the east, would send help. But no help came. And when the walls finally fell, the city's faith didn't stop the fire. The men were slaughtered, the women were enslaved, and the churches were stripped and burned. Milan was left silent. So here's the unsettling question: what happens when faith outlasts buildings, but the city itself doesn't? From the That's Jesus channel, welcome to Coach, Church Origins and Church History. I'm Bob Balch, and on Wednesdays we stay between 500 and 1500 AD. Today we look at Milan, a city most people know today as Italian Fashion Central. But in the early church, it was far more than that. It was a place of worship, learning, and influence. And yet in 540 AD, Milan's walls crumbled, its allies failed, and its churches went silent. What happened when one of Christianity's brightest cities was erased? And what can that story teach us now? To understand why Milan's fall mattered, we need to know what kind of city it was. In the 6th century, Milan was the second largest city in Italy with tens of thousands of residents. Its location was at the crossroads of trade routes that made it wealthy and influential. But it was more than just a marketplace. It was a center of Christian life. Back in the late 300s, Milan had been led by Ambrose, one of the most famous bishops in church history, and Ambrose had written hymns that Christians still sing today. He had confronted emperors when they tried to dominate the church, and he mentored Augustine, who became one of Christianity's greatest teachers. Because of Ambrose, Milan was not just politically strong, it was spiritually famous. Augustine later reflected that Milan's churches, under Ambrose's leadership, were a beacon of faith, drawing seekers from across the empire. The style of worship that grew there, called the Ambrosian rite, gave Milan its own identity, even distinct from Rome's identity. But by the year 540, Milan was caught in a much larger struggle. Emperor Justinian in Constantinople dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire's old glory. His generals were fighting the Ostrogoths, who ruled Italy after Rome's collapse in the west, and Milan sided with the Byzantines, trusting that their powerful allies would defend them. That trust would prove fatal. Procopius, the historian who chronicled Justinian's wars, tells us that the Byzantines quarreled instead of acting. And a century later, Gregory of Tours, not Tours, echoed the story of Milan's devastation. Okay, people, so I heard your feedback. In a couple of earlier episodes, I pronounced his name like a Texan, hard on that S, Gregory of Tours. So forgive me, the French way, and apparently the correct way is Gregory of Tours. So there you go. A century later, Gregory of Tours echoed the story of Milan's devastation. Milan's history, worship, and loyalty to its allies gave the city confidence, but all of that was about to collapse. When the Ostrogoths marched toward Milan, they didn't need to storm the walls right away. Ancient warfare had a slower, crueler method: the siege. Armies surrounded a city, cut off food, blocked water, and then they just waited. People trapped inside could hold out for a while, but eventually hunger and sickness and fear would break them. That's what happened to Milan. The Goths sealed every road, grain stopped flowing in, families rationed what little food they had, and bread grew scarce, and some starved. Imagine tens of thousands of people inside a walled city with no supply trucks, no relief forces, no way out. Each day, hope thinned. Inside the Byzantine command, help should have been on the way, but two generals were locked in a rivalry. Instead of working together, they argued. Procopius records it bluntly, quote, "The generals quarreled and delayed, and so the city perished." End quote. For the people of Milan, this was more than politics. It was betrayal. They had chosen their side. They had trusted the empire. They had prayed for rescue, and yet day after day, no banners appeared on the horizon for rescue. Faith had not left them, but confidence in their allies had, and soon the city's walls would not be enough. At last, those walls, they gave way, and the Goths poured into Milan. What followed was not mercy, it was a massacre. Procopius records that the men of the city were slaughtered outright, and the women and the children were seized and carried off into slavery. Think of what that meant. A city that had once echoed with Ambrosian hymns was now silent. The great churches stood empty, or they stood burning for a while. Families that had worshiped together for generations were ripped apart. Gregory of Tours later described the devastation as so complete that it seemed Milan had disappeared from the Christian map. The people of Milan were destroyed, their churches empty, and their voice lost. And the worst sting? The Byzantines never came. Promises of help dissolved into excuses. Rival generals saved their own reputations while a Christian city burned. This was not just the collapse of walls, it was the collapse of trust. Trust in emperors, trust in armies, even in the security of church buildings. And it forces us to ask, when everything we rely on fails, where does our faith rest? Milan's destruction was horrifying, but it wasn't the end of its story. Survivors carried their faith with them as they scattered to other towns. The Ambrosian style of worship, the hymns and prayers rooted in the days of Bishop Ambrose, they didn't vanish with the city's walls. Even centuries later, churches in northern Italy were still singing in the Ambrosian way. Faith endured because it was never tied only to one set of buildings. That lesson reaches across the centuries. Political power had failed. Imperial armies had failed. Even church structures had failed. But worship survived because it lived in people and not in stone. And today, the church faces a similar test, not through fire and siege, but through closures and decline. In the United States, 15,000 churches are projected to close by the end of 2025 alone. Researchers estimate that in the last 25 years, around 40 million Americans stopped attending church altogether. And Barna reports that 16% of those who went before the pandemic simply stopped during the pandemic, and then they never joined another congregation. Communities once full of worship can fall silent, just as Milan did. The challenge then, and the challenge now, is the same. Will worship live on in us, even when the structures we rely on collapse? Milan's fall leaves us with a hard but necessary question. Faith did not stop in the fires of Milan. Buildings did not guarantee protection. Promises from allies proved empty. What endured in Milan was worship carried in the hearts of survivors. So what about us? If our congregation closed its doors tomorrow, would our worship continue? Or would our faith quietly fade with the building that goes unused? If friends drifted away, if leaders disappointed us, if support that we assumed would always be there suddenly disappeared, would we still cling to Jesus? It's easy to confuse the strength of our faith with the strength of our institutions. But Milan reminds us, those things can crumble overnight. Faith endures only when it is rooted in Jesus himself. The survivors of Milan carried their worship wherever they went. And that's the same call on us today, to hold fast to Jesus, not because life is stable, but because Jesus is. If this story of Milan's destruction challenged or encouraged you, please like, comment, and share it with a friend. They might really need to hear it. Leave a review on your podcast app, and don't forget to follow Coach for more episodes every week. Check out the show notes. It has the full transcript and sources used for this episode. And if you look closely, you'll find some contrary opinions in there too. We do that on purpose. The Amazon links can help you get resources for your own library while giving me a little bit of a kickback as an Amazon associate I earn from qualifying purchases. And you never know what we'll cover next on Coach. Each episode dives into a different corner of church history, but on Wednesdays, we stay between 500 and 1500 AD. And if you'd rather access these stories through YouTube, check us out at the That's Jesus channel. Thanks for listening to Coach, Church Origins and Church History. I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Have a great day and be blessed. And if I mispronounce tour again, you can blame it on Texas, not that Gregory guy.